Anonymous asks, do you think developers view games in a different way than the press or public, so that it is difficult for them to understand some of the flaws and bugs? Hold on. Do you think the developers view games in a different way than the press or public? That is, they understand how difficult some of the flaws or bugs can be to fix and can overlook them to see the bigger picture, concept and design of the game when developing their opinion of it. I think one of the things that makes that abundantly clear is when we have these questions about graphical downgrades. There's currently one happening right now with The Witcher 3. There was a conversation about Watch Dogs. There was a conversation about Dark Souls 2. This seems to come up every 6 months or so. There's a new game in which the version that ships looks markedly different, or at least somewhat different, than the version that was shown off publicly in trailers or demos or to the press, and the version that's shipping looks worse. Of course, what the term "worse" even means is entirely subjective. So let's talk about what that means and kind of unpack that a little bit. I think what's interesting, or what's difficult for developers, is they are showing early versions of a game in which they are often showing it running on a high-end PC in the most ideal environment. And then what happens is that the game has to ship. And what happens when the game has to ship is that compromises have to be made in a variety of areas. And so let's take The Witcher, for example. Now, The Witcher is a game that was explicitly made this time around with consoles in mind. They knew when they conceived The Witcher 3, it was going to come out on the PC, the Xbox One, and the PlayStation 4. With The Witcher 2, they may have had aspirations to come out on Xbox 360, but they were forced to port that game and make that game work in a way that wasn't affected by the PC development. The console version was a completely autonomous entity in which the developers at CD Projekt Red were confronted with a way of having to transform a game that never was considered for consoles in the first place. And The Witcher 3 was a game that eventually was going to have to ship on consoles. And you're talking about the Xbox One and PS4, of which there are some subtle hardware differences, enough so that, relatively common, we find that games run at a slightly lower resolution on the Xbox One versus the PlayStation 4. So you take into account those three different hardware configurations, one of which is changing the PC, where people can kind of just throw more stuff at it, whereas on the console you have sort of a strict architecture, and those both have advantages and disadvantages. And I can understand why a developer would end up showing off what they aspirationally hope the game is going to be, right? They're going to show Witcher 3 in the most positive light, the best version of the game, the one that's running on the highest end hardware, and it looks gorgeous. But then when the rubber meets the road, when they've got to make it run on ordinary PCs, when they've got to make it run on consoles, that there are compromises made that end up making the game look different, or, as is often used as the case, worse. And I think this is an instance in which the developer would probably argue, and I think this is what CD Projekt Red has argued when they've talked about this briefly, is that when you ship a game, you have to make certain compromises in order to ship the game. And for consumers, I understand their anger as well. When they saw a game that looked better, now it looks worse. Why does it look worse? And then the easy scapegoat is that, they're putting it out on consoles. This is all the console's fault. I don't know if that's necessarily true. We'll never know. I think it can be a factor. I would not doubt that the game is altered or designed in certain ways so it could accommodate a console architecture that doesn't scale in the same way the PC stuff does. That said, is it also understandable that a game is going to be different before it's released and after it's released? It is. Is it also understandable that people would be upset that they feel like they were sold something different or pre-ordered something different, and then when it's shipping, the version that they're going to play, it looks a bit different. It looks a bit worse. Those are all things that I think are legitimate gripes from all sides. And I looked at a video over The Witcher 3 that was like low detail, high detail, and absolutely the low detail version looks worse, but it's still an unbelievably gorgeous game, even at low detail. And I think, if we're to revisit some of the eye rolling that sometimes happens amongst the press, and I think sometimes I understand why they do it, and I'm certainly complicit in that, and I think other times I don't understand why they do it, is maybe it's the press understanding, these compromises happen. Sometimes the games look a little worse when they ship, but, that's them's the breaks, and also the game looks pretty great. And that's different than, for example, like Dark Souls 2, a game that looked as though they had ripped out an entire lighting engine that made the game look substantially different in the shipping product. There are different versions of this story that get told. And I think it's a complicated question that isn't as simple as they downgraded it, because CD Projekt Red is a studio that takes their games really, really seriously. They take their players really, really seriously. And this may be a case in which, to appeal to a broader base, to be a more ambitious studio, they maybe had to make some cuts to ship the game. The game has obviously been delayed several times. Maybe that stuff's linked to it. Maybe in order to get the game shipping out the door and not delaying it to the fall yet again, they had to make some compromises. And so for that to get sort of condensed into an Imager post that is just like, look what this game looked like and look what it looks like now. I imagine that's frustrating for developers, and that's frustrating for consumers. Both sides feel like they don't see eye to eye on it, and then sometimes the press rolls their eyes at the whole thing, which doesn't help matters. So, as a long-winded way of answering that question, but good question.